Hello and welcome to NewsNight. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. It's our pleasure to have you join us today. Those who provide relief and succor to the victims of conflict are very often overlooked by history, but their role is critical to the survival chances of those caught in those conflicts. In Nigeria, many international humanitarian organizations are fully involved in helping those who are caught up in conflict, particularly in the Northeast region, where the conflict has been on for more than a decade. My guest says more than 24,000 people are designated as missing, the largest anywhere, and his organization is helping families to locate them. NewsNight talks to the Global Vice President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Gilles Carbonnier. Gilles Carbonnier, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
Now, ICRC is in more than 90 countries of the world. They operate in more than 90 countries. Why did you choose Nigeria for this visit instead of any other country?
I chose Nigeria for two reasons. First, Nigeria is a powerhouse in the region and globally. It's a member of the G20. It is a very influential country in the region. So it is key for the international community of the engage Nigeria on humanitarian priorities. And second, Nigeria has a Northeast and situations of armed violence in other parts of the country. And this is where we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, together with the Nigeria Red Cross, we seek to assist the people who are affected by armed conflict and also to protect them. So we have large operations in the country. We have about 800 staff and a budget of over 95 million US dollars to try to assist and protect the people affected by the conflict, by violence in Nigeria.
Now, before we come to Nigeria itself properly, let me just ask you generally first about your activities, the activities of the ICRC on the African continent. What can you tell us about that? Well,
Africa accounts for about half of our worldwide operations. So it's a huge area of investment of humanitarian activities for us. And at present, we have great concerns and a lot of activities in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, where, as you know, we have a massive humanitarian crisis. But we are also active in many other situations of armed conflict, all the way from Mozambique to the Central African Republic, the DRC, of course Nigeria, but also the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. Our priority there is to engage all the parties to respect international humanitarian law, which means that they protect and respect the civilian population who must be spared, and also the civilian infrastructure so that people can have access to health services, to water, etc. And then we provide assistance to the people affected across these different regions in Africa. And we work so that at least, some of the suffering that they are encountered can be alleviated. But what we try to do also is to find sustainable solutions in protracted situation of violence and crisis, so that people can have access to income-generating activities and they can resume their livelihoods.
Now let's come to Nigeria itself, and of course in your the answer to the first question, you mentioned activities in the Northeast. Before we come and zero in on the Northeast itself, talk generally about the activities of the ICRC in Nigeria.
Well, in Nigeria, we have the whole set of activities of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So we engage with the authorities, with the military and others to respect and protect the civilians and to protect civilian infrastructure. What we do also is that we provide medical assistance, hospitals, healthcare centers, especially in these regions where people are in conflict, they are displaced, they are particularly vulnerable. We also provide assistance for the provision of safe drinking water to reduce waterborne disease. And this is what I could see in Maiduguri and in Bama. And we also try to reunite families because we have many people who lost track of their loved ones when they were displaced. And what we have here is 24,000 families asking us and the Nigeria Red Cross to help reunite them with their daughters, their brothers, parents, when they have been separated because of the conflict. So these are, a whole set of activities that we are running across the countries, especially the Northeast.
I'm happy that you mentioned the Northeast, even though one is not happy particularly with what is going on there. And you talk about a visit to Maiduguri and Bama. Can you give us an idea of your impression during the course of that visit?
Well, my first impression is that humanitarian needs remain very large. It is estimated that over 2 million, possibly 2.2 million Nigerians have been displaced because of the conflict. Sometimes they have been displaced various times, losing their belonging, losing their access to an income-generating activity. And what I saw, especially for instance in Bama, is arrival of new waves of displaced people, very vulnerable. So it is key that we continue to provide them immediate life-saving assistance. At the same time, I see that there is a need to sustain the health system, the health structure, because in many locations, primary health care centers, hospitals are not functional or not fully functional. So this is what we do. What we also try to do is to make sure that people, vulnerable people, have access to safe drinking water, they have access to food, and this will be key during also 2022. And we are fully committed to continue our assistance operations so that we can assist and serve the people in need.
In doing all of this, of course, there is the need, indeed, the desire to collaborate with the authorities, state governments, the federal governments, perhaps even the local governments. What's the situation with that? How easy has it been for the ICRC to collaborate with the various agencies of government?
You're right. It is key for us to cooperate with all the relevant state agencies at different levels. So first, I want to highlight that we work in full transparency. We always inform the authorities about our activities, and we always seek, of course, authorization for what we do. Second, when we work, we try to support public services that provide vital goods and services to the people. So, to give you one example, I was in Maiduguri State Hospital, and there we have 2 surgical teams that really try to help support the provision of surgical services, surgical interventions, especially for conflict-related wounded, injured people. And the same applies to water boards. We work with the water board in Maiduguri. I visited a water plant that we support so that it can service the displaced people and the host communities, because you have to imagine that with this arrival of displaced people, the pressure on public services is huge. So it is our task to work with the relevant authorities to support their capacities to provide essential services. So I would say overall we do engage quite a lot, even if we work always as a purely humanitarian, independent and neutral organization. Of course, we support the provision of essential services through the Nigerian relevant line ministries and services.
Given the scenario in the Northeast, for example, it's more like a conflict zone. It's almost like a war zone. And in that situation, of course, you'll be coming across the armed forces, members of the military who are there to enforce the peace and to return law and order and all of that. What's been the effort like? What's been the collaboration? Do you see collaboration? Maybe that's the first question one should ask. Do you get collaboration from them to enhance your activities?
Well, across the world, across Africa and in Nigeria, we have a specific mandate under the Geneva Conventions, under international humanitarian law. And our mandate is to promote the respect for international humanitarian law with the armed forces and the security forces. So this is something that we do in all countries of the world, even in peacetime, so that the armed forces, the military, are aware of their obligations and responsibility under international humanitarian law to respect and protect the civilians and also to take care of the wounded. So this is something that we do in Nigeria. We engage the military at different levels, and we have done so for many, many years, in order to discuss issues related to international humanitarian law and implementation of international humanitarian law, especially in the conflict areas. And at the same time, what we do across all conflict regions is that we try to ensure that we have a safe access to the field, because we have to be able to access the communities affected by conflict in order to bring assistance and to bring our humanitarian services. And to do that, we have to seek the acceptance of all the parties so that we are able to access and provide humanitarian services. So this is also why we engage the military and security services, so that they understand who we are, what we do, and that we can then access the communities in need with the understanding of the parties.
That brings me to something that sometimes is a bit touchy, and you related to it a bit earlier on when you talked about international humanitarian law. The ICRC is global. It's recognized as a neutral, non-partisan, non-political player or stakeholder in most areas where it operates. Now, the military, on the other hand, is there on a mission. So one would wonder, where is a thin line to walk, isn't it, between being regarded as one of those to be involved in peacemaking and just being there for humanitarian services. In the case of Nigeria, what has been the experience like in terms of collaboration? Do you get expected cooperation from the Nigerian military?
Well, you are right. It's a touchy issue always in conflict. You know, my organization, the ICRC, we are soon 160 years old. And since Henri Dunant was crossing the line 160 years ago in Solferino between, the different parties to the conflict, this is what we, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, stand for, is to be a neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian actor able to provide humanitarian life-saving assistance across lines. And for that, indeed, we need to engage, but under international humanitarian law, we are also recognized as a humanitarian organization that has this capacity and duty to be in the field, bringing assistance and trying to protect the civilian population. So in Nigeria, this is what we have done, and we continue to do. And I must say that we have engaged the military at different levels, all the way from the central level to the field level. And we always continue to maintain this dialogue on international humanitarian law, on access, so that we are able to carry out our work. And of course, this is something we highly appreciate and value, because it's the only way we are able then to provide services to people in need.
Your staff are sometimes put in harm's way, particularly in the northeast of Nigeria. They are put in harm's way because sometimes some of the parties to the conflict there do not respect the fact that these are neutral arbiters who are trying to help. What can you tell us about what the experience has been in that regard, particularly with the Northeast?
Well, I must admit, security and access in the Northeast is a big challenge. And it has been so for long because, of course, as a responsible employer with 800 or over 800 staff working in the country, we have to make sure that our staff can operate in full security. So we do all what we can to maintain this level of safety and security, but at times it means that we don't have access to places where people are in dire need because of security concerns. Now, if you look at attacks, we have seen in the Northeast, indeed, as in other places in the country, attacks not only on humanitarian organizations, but also on the medical structures, so on medical staff and healthcare facilities. So what we do is that we have launched a worldwide campaign to ask for protecting and not attacking the healthcare centers, the healthcare workers, and humanitarian workers, because they must be respected, especially in those places where you have an armed conflict and armed violence, because it is in those places that people need it most. And the problem with these attacks is that the result is that the most vulnerable people then are the ones who don't get access to any treatment, they don't have access to any healthcare services. So this is a permanent concern, and we are calling to all the parties, and we are making a plea to indeed respect and protect medical facilities, healthcare workers, and humanitarian workers.
You've got long experience. I'm talking about the ICRC now. You've got plenty of experience in different conflict areas, under different circumstances, with different people, since 1864, as you were alluding to, 160 years in the business. From that experience, what would you say traditionally are the greatest needs of victims, of people caught in the crossfire in conflict zones?
You know what? We see that these are changing. The priority needs of the people are changing because armed conflict is changing. What we see is that armed conflicts across the world, they tend to be more protracted. They last forever longer. Second, they tend also to be more urban. Cities are affected directly, and this is quite different in terms of humanitarian consequences. And thirdly, we see more fragmentation. We see that armed groups are ever more fragmented. We have calculated last year that there are about over 600 armed groups active in different conflicts. So this raises a lot of challenges in terms of the needs of the population and our capacity to operate. And secondly, if I look at the needs, one thing which is interesting is that when I started as a humanitarian worker 32 years ago, the first thing people were asking is food and medical services. Today, the first thing a displaced person asks is connectivity. Please, could I connect so that I can call back my family to say that I'm safe? Please, could I connect so that I can have information about the situation and see what is the best option for my own security? So we have adapted also our response, and often to reconnect families together, we offer digital services, connectivity, so that indeed, for instance, a daughter or a son is able to call back his or her mother, her father, to say, hey, I have been displaced, but I'm safe, I'm here, and then they can see what is best for themselves.
The Northeast is one area where the conflict, if we call it that, is not traditional. I'm sure back in 1864 and for a long time after that, the conflict would be between two, what we call today, regular armies who have standard operating procedures, rules of engagement, and so on. What we have seen increasingly is that there's been a migration from that onto what we've called guerrilla or asymmetric warfare now, where one or two or more sides to the conflict know nothing or don't respect international law. and therefore some of the needs that we have just talked about are different in such circumstances. Has that been the experience in the northeast of Nigeria?
Well, you're very right. What we have seen is that while long time ago we had international armed conflict between states, what we see as the vast majority of the cases is non-international armed conflict within a state. And we see that there are, as I mentioned, an ever greater fragmentation of armed groups. We have calculated that overall in the world we have over 600 armed groups involved in armed conflicts. But it means also that de facto we have possibly up to 150, 160 million people living in territories which are either not under the full control of states or not under the control of state at all. And the question is, how can we still support and maintain the livelihood and the lives of these millions of civilians, children, elders, women, in places where they don't have access to public services, etc. Now, when it comes to the Northeast, indeed the situation is challenging. Now it's over 10 years that we have an armed conflict ongoing, and we can see that the coping mechanisms of some of the local population is really stretched to the limits. And after 10 years, what we try to do when we assist them is not only to provide immediate assistance, but also to provide them with seed capital, a grant, and to provide them with some training so that they can resume an income generating activities. They can resume a professional life, and they can move out of aid dependency as soon as possible. So we have seen, when I was in Bama and also in Maiduguri, I have seen great successes. I have seen among both the displaced population and the host communities, Nigerians being able to resume a professional life as traders, as carpenters, as charcoal collectors and sellers, as for also tailors, and they were extremely proud, some of them, because not only they could resume a small income generating activities, but some of them they could hire staff, and they could even buy a plot of land. So you see, even in the midst of a long-standing, protracted conflict, we find ways to find solutions whereby people can regain dignity and they can sustain themselves and their families in a dignified manner. And this is challenging, but this is what we are trying to do.
Undoubtedly, you talked earlier about the numbers of people in need, the numbers of people who require different types of assistance. And particularly in northeast Nigeria, this conflict there has been on for well over a decade. Could you give us some of the statistics of what the ICRC has been faced with, and what has it been able to do?
Well, I can give you numbers because these numbers are important. It's really humanitarian outcomes that change the lives of people. So just to give you a few examples, we have been able to provide safe drinking water in Maiduguri last year for 85,000 people, and this year we are increasing to 150,000 people by restoring and upgrading the capacity of a major water pumping station. We are also considering to see a master plan to help build a stronger water provision systems for the whole city, but this will be possibly, moving from direct humanitarian assistance to more development type of project. Now, when it comes to health, in the state hospital of Borno in Maiduguri, and there our surgical teams, they have taken care of about 400 people with gunshot wounds, and these people have been either being able to rebuild their lives, or for those who are with a disability. We have a physical rehabilitation center there that is brand new, and where last year we could equip over 400 people with prosthesis, with other equipment, so that they can regain their mobility. And the objective is that through regained mobility, they can also reinsert society. And we have also other activities when it comes to nutritional assistance for the very severely malnourished children in particular. So these are all activities that we will continue to do during 2022. We have received, with the Nigerian Red Cross, 24,000 requests of families that are looking for their loved ones. So we are doing a tracing work in order to try to find out the whereabouts and the fate of 24,000 missing Nigerians, in order to be able to reconnect them with their families. And you have to know that this is the highest number of missing requests that we have received in Africa, and it amounts to about half of the overall requests that we have received in Africa in terms of tracing, family tracing requests to establish again a link to their loved ones who have gone missing. So this will remain a priority for us as well.
All the programs you've mentioned, the one thing that seems to run through all of them is that this costs money. And as a humanitarian voluntary organization, sourcing for funds, like your colleagues, would be difficult, especially in an environment where the economics, even in the areas where you are operating and in the areas where you expect to get funds from, may not be quite salutary at all times. What have been the challenges associated with funding for humanitarian organizations like yours?
Funding is a big challenge. What we see now is that the needs are increasing because of the combined effect of climate change, protracted armed conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only just the sanitary impact, but also the economic and social impact of COVID-19. And through this combined crisis, we meet communities with increasing needs, but at the same time our traditional donors have less resources because they have redirected some of their resources from foreign aid to domestic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really need to diversify our funding sources, and we are calling to all the 196 signatory to the Geneva Conventions to support us, including Nigeria.
That brings me to COVID-19 itself. I'm sure COVID-19 has had impact on two levels. It has had impact on your work as an organization, and it has had impact on those that you're trying to assist in the various conflict zones. Probably differences depending on where. Can you give us more enlightenment about how that has unfolded? I mean, COVID-19 has been with us now for about 2 years.
Impacts at so many levels, but I think that what we have seen with COVID-19 is that adding to the climate crisis and to the armed conflicts, it has stretched the coping capacities of local population to the limits. So this is where we have to step up our game and be more effective, be more innovative and efficient in our response. So we have tried to devise innovative responses to the crisis. I will give you two examples. One is that we have equipped healthcare centers in Adamawa State with a new tablet that is powered by an algorithm that helps to diagnose infant diseases. And through that, I have reports from the Adamawa State health authorities that we have reduced infant mortality while reducing also the wrong intake of antibiotics. So this type of innovation really helps to multiply the impact that we can have. Another innovation, you discussed about funding before. And what we have done is that we have developed new innovative financing models through a humanitarian impact bond. And it is thanks to this humanitarian impact bond where private investors invested money that we could build the physical rehabilitation center in Maiduguri. So you see, it needs innovation, it needs to try to be more effective. At the same time, what we need to do is to support the health services and also the people in general to take protective measures, to be more aware of what are the major protective measures to try to avert getting infected by COVID-19. And with the Nigeria Red Cross, we have expanded this outreach to the people so that they take the right protective measures. And of course, there is a need to also support the healthcare centers and services to respond not only to COVID-19 because it's one of the priority, but as you know, there are many other health priorities in the country, and especially in the Northeast, that we try to support through our activities.
That brings me, of course, in the initial question I asked, I talked about two groups of people. You've talked about, getting the people, but in terms of ICRC personnel themselves and exposure to COVID-19 and other such ailments, Ebola and dengue fever and all the other things that affect workers who go out into the field in some of these areas to help people. What's been the experience like, and how has the Red Cross been coping with the fact that some of its staff sometimes fall victim to this as well?
Some of our staff indeed got infected like anybody else by COVID, but they had also great concerns for their own families and loved ones while they were trying to respond to the needs of the population in the field. So what we did is to really increase what we call our duty of care towards our own staff. The ICRC, we've been really doing a lot of progress over the past 2 decades in increasing, enhancing, and improving our duty of care to care for our staff. Very important here, 800 staff in Nigeria. The vast majority are Nigerian colleagues, bright colleagues, very committed. So we have to take care really of their health, so that not only for themselves, but also that they are able to provide then humanitarian services in the field. We do this across the world, and doing also, for instance, in Afghanistan throughout last year, as we have 1,800 staff in Afghanistan who remained active and present despite the fact that you had many uncertainties and changes in Afghanistan, and we are still committed to support and provide proper duty of care for themselves, but also that they are able to continue their humanitarian work, because we have the chance to count on extremely committed staff who do their utmost and protect people affected, especially in Nigeria, as I could see during my last few days of visiting our activities in the Northeast, as well as discussing here in Abuja with the colleagues that we have.
The ICRC is not the only humanitarian or voluntary organization in operation in the Northeast in Nigeria or in the country generally, and even across the world. In various places, others, the World Food Program, Médecins Sans Frontières, there's Doctors Without Borders, and so on, a whole host of organizations work. How much collaboration is there between the Red Cross and these other organizations, and in what areas?
Look, first we have regular exchanges and coordination. I think the needs and our capacities is limited, so we cannot afford to waste our resources through duplication, through going for the wrong priorities. So we do coordinate in order to avoid the duplications, but we coordinate also because each of us, we have specific expertise and value added in different areas, and we have also different. So typically the International Committee of the Red Cross, we have specific expertise, as I mentioned to you, in physical rehabilitation, assistance in the medical sector, water, providing safe drinking water, looking at missing people, but also engaging the parties on their own responsibilities under international humanitarian law. But also we do, each of us try to provide our value added through our main areas of expertise. And I think that I can say that in Nigeria, these exchanges, this coordination are very regular and they work smoothly. And we always have to improve that coordination to avoid any waste.
The ICRC operates in various parts of the world. We've focused a bit on the Northeast because you are in Nigeria, and the Northeast is one of the conflict zones, one of the most prominent conflict zones in the country, and it has been for well over a decade as we've been speaking. But could you give us an idea of some of the hottest, and I use that word advisedly, some of the hottest conflict zones, speaking globally now, and what has been the experience of your organization in those areas, and how have you been able to tackle those challenges in those areas?
If I have to select two hottest conflict zones today, I would select Ethiopia, Tigray, and Afghanistan. In Ethiopia, we have activities all across the country, but we have offices in Tigray as well. And it has been key for us to maintain contacts, of course, with the Ethiopian government and the other parties, so that we are able to remain present and work, because needs, especially when it comes to food security, access to healthcare, are just huge. We are extremely concerned about the situation, and we have resumed last week our flights to bring directly from Addis Ababa assistance to Mekele, to Tigray, for the people in need. And what is key is that this assistance and this access is maintained over time, so that we are able to deploy our activities. But of course, what is also key is that for the medium to long run, we have to find a solution, because as often is the case, there is no humanitarian solution to protracted humanitarian crisis. Take Syria. In Syria, we have seen that we can try to save lives, alleviate suffering, but only political solution can bring a lasting response to the plight of the people. Now, Afghanistan is very different. What we have been facing since the arrival and de facto arrival to power of the Taliban has been that the international aid has been completely withdrawn, and the sanctions that have been imposed made the provision of aid very difficult, if not impossible. What we've done is to engage all the major powers and actors to carve out first humanitarian exemptions in the sanction regimes, so that we are able to bring medical assistance, but also to pay our staff, 1,800 staff, and to make sure that if we, as we do, we are assisting 17 hospitals with 5,500 health staff. These health workers haven't received any salary since last August. So it is key to find a way that these health workers, who are the same nurses, the same with midwives, the same doctors that were serving the population before August and the change of the regime in power, that they are paid so that they can continue their life-saving work. So you see, for us, it has been new because we had to engage with ministries of finance, with agencies responsible of implementing sanctions, so that we can carve out the space necessary to avoid a major humanitarian catastrophe. And in Afghanistan, if there is no liquidity if there is no possibility to revive the economy, we think that we might see a major humanitarian catastrophe during this winter. So it is key to buy time and to find a temporary solution so that people can have access to incomes and people can regain some of their livelihoods.
In your answer to some of the questions, several times you've mentioned international humanitarian law as well as the Geneva Convention. Now, many of those who are watching and listening to this probably don't know what that means. And could you enlighten a bit on what the international humanitarian law essentially is, what the Geneva Convention talks about, and what are the efforts to ensure that states, in particular, comply with the provisions, particularly the states that have signed up to this convention and to the fact that they intend to respect international humanitarian law?
Basically, the Geneva Conventions are about our core humanity, which must be protected even in the worst of circumstances. Even in the middle of an armed conflict, in the heat of combat, those who take part to the hostilities, they have to comply by a certain number of fundamental rules to protect our minimal humanity. And what are they? They are first the question of protecting civilians who are not party to the conflict, children, women, elders and others who are not taking part to the conflict but must be protected from the impact of the conflict. Secondly, there is a question of the proportionality of the means that are used. So in the Geneva Conventions, you have this principle that, and more broadly with international humanitarian law, that the means that are put into motion in a conflict must remain proportional to the threat. An extreme example is, of course, that you wouldn't use a nuclear bomb to respond to the threat of 2 or 3 fighters in the middle of a city, because you would have an extreme, huge number of civilians killed and extreme consequences for the sake of a threat which is limited. So this is the second. And third is that military commanders, they have to take all the precautions necessary to make sure that then when they decide an attack, when they target an enemy, then the so-called collateral damages, meaning the civilians are protected and the collateral damages are minimized. So these are the fundamental principles. And then there is another principle, is that when someone is injured, is out of combat, that person who is injured must receive medical treatment. And finally, when a combatant is out of combat because he's captured, he's is detained. Once detained, this person must be treated humanely. So these are the fundamental principles that have been established many years ago, and these are not principles of humanitarians who would be dreaming. The Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law are negotiated by states, including the military. And it strikes a balance between legitimate security concerns of states who are legitimate to take measures to ensure their own security and the security of the citizens, and on the other hand, the imperative of humanity, where suffering must be limited and where lives must be protected. And striking this balance is very difficult. It's not an easy task, but this is what the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law are all about, and it works. So in the media, very often we hear about violations of the Geneva Conventions. That's what makes head news. But I can tell you that every day, my colleague reports back to us that they could bring an injured fighter through checkpoints to receive treatment to the hospital. And of course, then that fighter might be going through a judicial proceeding and might be, condemned in an appropriate tribunal. But at least once injured, a proper medical treatment is provided. Every day, we hear military commanders who tell us, look, I have decided not to target this military objective in this town because I realized that around the military target there were so many children and civilians that I could not attack now that target. And this doesn't make any head news, but it saves everyday lives. It protects the dignity of people in the most dire situations, and this is what we fight for.
It seems as if the ICRC has made a policy decision not to get involved in operations in the Northwest, for example, where you have banditry, a lot of banditry and cattle rustling and other such activities against civilians. Is that true? Is it a matter of fact that the ICRC is not in operation in those areas, and if so, why?
Well, with our limited means, we decide to focus on the locations where we have the most vulnerable people. And if you take the Northeast, we have over 2.2 million people who have been displaced, and displacement goes on. So we concentrate our activities, especially in that region, but we are also active in the region of Jos. When I came here, it was 2 years ago. I could see our operation in the Jos region, Plateau State, where we try also to assist people who are impacted by armed violence, and this is what we try to do also to some extent in the south region. And with limited means, we have to prioritize, and we want to provide a response to the most vulnerable who are at present in the Northeast in particular. But of course, we do monitor the situation, and based on the needs and our capacities, things might evolve, but for the time being, this is really the priority that we have, is in particularly in the Northeast.
My final question, you talked about it earlier on in the course of the discussion when you mentioned that most of the time conflicts are the result of political decisions, decisions made by political leaders worldwide. That's what you find. Now, you are in a position to speak to the ones in Nigeria and worldwide. What would you be telling them about this situation, the link between their decisions and the conflicts that result, and what they need to do differently or better to minimize, if not eradicate, conflict, which results in groups like yours having so much work to do?
Well, I think there are maybe two levels, or two questions in your question. The first one is the fact that we have a greater number of protracted conflicts where there is no solutions in sight. Think of Yemen, think of Syria, think of, we'll see for Afghanistan. So it is key that in these situations, the international community, and in particular, of course, the UN Security Council, is able to carve out solutions that are conducive to put an end to this protracted conflict. And then at a more field level, I think that what we see more and more is that we have a great number of states having direct and indirect relations with parties to non-international armed conflicts. And we do engage those states because we are convinced that they can play a positive influence through their different relations and relationship with parties to the conflict. And we call on them to play this, this positive role that they can have to exert a positive influence for greater respect by the parties to the conflict, to respect the Geneva Conventions, to respect international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, and to minimize the harm that is being done. So this is, I think, an area of great engagement for us. We will continue to do so, calling on a greater number of states who are not themselves direct party to a conflict, but who can exert a very positive influence because they have relations, be it in terms of training, in terms of the provision of weapons, be it in terms of the provision of advice and intelligence. And I think that this is what we have started to do ever more, is to seek in our confidential dialogue with each and every state to see what kind of positive influence can be exerted to basically reduce the suffering that is inflicted on innocent civilians who suffer sometimes for several generations in a row from protracted conflict.
Gilles Carbonnier, best of luck in all these endeavors. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com/podcast to get started. I am Ladi Akiridoluale. Goodbye.